Another social justice activist, Lekha Patel, is going to be talking to us about the International Day of the Girl Child. But I do believe that Brooks is on the line. So, very good morning to you, Brooks. Spector, welcome to the program.
Yeah, good morning. I'm sorry, we have to do this by phone rather than visually. My apologies. There
No
seems to be
worries. No worries.
a
I would have preferred a visual interview, but these things do happen, don't they? Um, let's talk about that very dire situation in the Ukraine. Now, obviously, at least 11 people were killed and 64 others wounded by Russia's missile strikes across Ukraine on Monday. I imagine that was a retaliatory attack um, on the Ukrainian people because of the blow up of that very key link, the bridge that links the Crimea to Russia. And of course, as we understanding, other media are suggesting that that was Vladimir Putin's pet project. He was very, very proud of that bridge. So he is raving mad at the moment, is he not? Raging mad at the moment, is he not?
well, I mean, the problem is that the bridge was largely a military target because it was used significantly for supply or resupply troops, materiel, fuel supplies for the
Mm,
southern wing of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The missile attacks, rockets, cruise missiles, whatever material they were using, has fallen not on military targets, not even conceivably on things that might be military targets, and they were either badly targeted or they were deliberately untargeted. They've hit nursery schools and apartment buildings and playgrounds and streets and various things. Even even as the Russians continue to do this, the Ukrainians have said, look, this simply doubles our resolve to fight off the Russian invasion. So, as a terror tactic, it probably has failed. As a military tactic, it has been useless. What it has done, of course, is that it has caused, as you correctly point out, casualties, both fatalities and people wounded, and it's damaged civilian infrastructure in various ways. But what it hasn't done is achieve any measurable military means, and that's important because uh, an effort to create terror among civilians is precisely the kind of thing that represents a war on civilians rather than against the military.
So, Brooke, it kind of almost seems as if Russia is becoming more and more desperate, and really trying to do everything possible to continue terrorizing the Ukrainians. I thought by this late stage, by this time of the year, peace talks would have resumed, and some form of a truce would have been in place. But it seems as if Russia is really intent of doing everything in its power to continue the attacks on the Ukraine. And as you also point out, it seems we're not sure if it was deliberate or not, but it seems every time that they do attack the Ukrainians, it's always civilian targets that are the casualties. Um, so, what exactly is going on here? Why do you believe that Russia is so almost desperate and so aggressive in its attack on the Ukraine?
Well, the challenge is, of course, is that the Russians have a very large arsenal of precisely this kind of weapon, and they certainly haven't used them all up. And so, conceivably, if they should so choose, uh, Russia's military commanders and its president could institute a further, more ferocious even more lethal rain of missiles and cruise missiles and drones attacks on yet more civilian targets. Because, as I said earlier, the key is these aren't in fact being targeted on military circumstances at all. They are as close to indiscriminate as you can get, except for perhaps falling into the farmland. And the problem is that for everything that happens in which the Ukrainians succeed in achieving some measure of military success, it seems likely then that the Russians will retaliate with yet more attacks on civilian infrastructure, civilian facilities, and civilians. And that leaves open the door, at least partially, to the kind of thing that the Russians, various officials, have been threatening now for the last number of weeks, which is the possibility of the use of tactical nuclear weapons. And when we say tactical nuclear weapons, we don't mean something that is small. We mean something that has the possibility of eliminating completely whole city blocks, square miles of a city, or troop concentrations, or other infrastructure, and of course the release of radioactive particles and radioactive gas into the atmosphere, which would affect both Ukrainian individuals, Russians, and people in the West. The weather doesn't necessarily discriminate on the basis of war strategy. And if that happens, then the Russians have of course crossed over against a norm that has held inviolate in the world since 1945. And that would be a truly extraordinary and horrific step for them to take. But, as you allude to, the more and more desperate Russian military circumstances become, perhaps the closer they come to that kind of decision. And so here we are, and as you also point out, we're entering shortly in the Ukrainian region the early onset of winter, which makes it that much more difficult to carry out military activities, first because of the mud season, and then because of the freezing and the snow and the ice and the cold. So this begins to limit the amount of military activity and increase the possibility of more rocket attacks.
Brooks, I know that the United Nations, the European Union, the US, the UK, etc., have all been making noises about some form of peace talks having to happen, because obviously no one on the globe, no country on the globe can risk nuclear weapons being fired on the Ukraine, because as you've just rightly pointed out, it's not only that part of the world that's going to suffer the consequences of all of that radioactive side effects, etc. It's going to go all around the world. What do you believe is going to take for the Russians to sit down and with the Ukrainians and other interested parties to try and call a truce and to agree to negotiate and agree to call off this supposed war or incursion on the Ukrainian people?
Well, I mean, the problem is, simply put, that eventually all wars end. They end in negotiations, or they end in abject surrender, or they dribble away and simply, snarling and growling across a frontier that's not peaceful, but they end. But a negotiation, of course, requires both parties to negotiate. The Ukrainians argue with some justice that their negotiating position is pretty straightforward: evacuate all Russian troops from Ukrainian territory, and this is a position they have set out in the past. Evacuate all Russian troops from Ukrainian territory, sea tax, and put the discussion about the ultimate status of Crimea ahead for negotiations down the road. The Russians, on the other hand, at least so far, have indicated their position is rather simple. Ukraine must accept Russian dictates about where what territories are or are not Ukraine, and they must accept dictates by Russia about who Ukraine can or cannot engage as friends. And Ukrainians at this point have made it quite clear they wish to join the European Union, and they're making the kind of noises say something similar, excuse me, about joining NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And now, in neither of those pieces is it automatic. There are negotiations that take place and require the unanimous consent of all the members of either of those multinational institutions. So in neither case will that happen this week, next, or across, next month. But the Russian position, so far at least, does not seem amenable to the kind of negotiations that produce a sense of equivalence between the two parties. The Russian position is one of superiority versus subservience, and that's not a fruitful path for negotiation so far.
In the meantime, we understand that Germany is to deliver air defense systems to the Ukraine within days. I'm kind of wondering, and this, of course, following Russia's barrage of missile attacks on the Ukraine. Is this not going to further exacerbate the situation? Is that not going to push the Russians closer to the edge of possibly going the nuclear weaponry route?
No, I don't think it will specifically. I mean, the unhappy history of diplomatic and consular facilities being attacked either by misapprehension or mistake or surreptitiously, deliberately has happened in the past, and it doesn't always result in war. And I can point to one particularly unhappy example of an American attack on what was believed to have been, so was said, a military command facility in Belgrade during the hostilities over the status of Kosovo, which turned out to be part of a Chinese diplomatic facility, and that, of course, did not lead to war between the United States and China. Now, what it did lead to was payment for damages and an apology, and that is kind of what happens in these circumstances. Diplomatic and consular territory is supposed to be inviolate. You can't attack it, you can't enter it, etc. But things do happen, and then there are sort of standardized mechanisms by which you pull back, apologize, pay compensation, and so forth. It's not going to make the Russian and German relationship any better. In fact, it's going to make the German response that much more supportive of Ukraine. But by itself, it's not going to open the doorway that we talked about earlier. What would, I think, open the doorway for a Russian tactical nuclear use would be a utter collapse of a portion of the Russian military front, say in the southern part of the country around the port city of Kherson, or perhaps yet further in the east, right up to the Russian border, in a disorderly way as Russian troops flee back across their own border. That might, and emphasize the word might, underline it, put it in italics, paint it red, in capital letters, all bold. It might lead to contemplation in the Kremlin about what do we have to lose, and therefore using a very low yield battlefield nuclear weapon. But at that point, of course, then the consequences of radiation and the consequences of international approbation become that much stronger. And so I guess what I'm really saying is, so far at least, I see this as a kind of very high stakes bluff on the part of the Russians, rather than if you do X, we will do Y, so you better not do X kind of maneuver. But events could prove us wrong.
Sure. It's really a wait and see game, is it not? But in the interim, there's so much of infrastructure damage and lives, innocent lives being lost. Finally, let's look at the issue around still on Germany. I understand that Germany are going to be conducting their own investigation into the Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines, the explosion there. Would that hamper their relations at all with Russia? Could they stop those investigations, or would they allow Germany to go on and come to their own conclusions and perhaps, try and repair, the damage that's been done to those 2 pipelines?
Well, I think the Germans are certainly within their sovereign rights to conduct any negotiation about the damage to the pipeline that they so wish to do. The Swedes have already done such a thing, and the Danes have already done a preliminary one as well. The Germans, are certainly within their rights and responsibilities, if for no other reason than to look at the environmental and ecological disaster that leaking huge amounts of natural gas into the Baltic Sea has resulted in. Repairing the damage is an entirely different thing, because the pipeline is a joint enterprise, and I believe that ultimately the responsibility for maintenance, I stand to be corrected if I'm wrong on this, but the responsibility for the maintenance of the pipeline is largely a Russian one. And they are making dark mutterings about sabotage and other secret forces and such like. And no one yet knows whether it was simply a mechanical failure, whether it was a self-sabotage, or whether it was Ukrainian saboteurs. Although I doubt that the Ukrainians have a whole lot of experience with underwater sabotage. They don't seem to have had that history. But whatever the cause was, as I go back, the Germans certainly have the right to investigate it. Making German-Russian relationships worse, we're already at a pretty low ebb as it is. The investigation and the issuance of a report is not going to change that very much, unless the Germans conclude that it was purely an act of God.
Okay, we need to end off there, but I do have 3 messages from someone called Eagle Eyes. I'd like to read them out, and if you have any comments, I'd like to hear them. The first comment is: hypocrisy of the US and Western countries has been exposed in this Russian-Ukraine war. That's the first comment. Second one: US and Western countries are supporting terrorist Israel against Palestine, and here they're condemning Russia. Total hypocrisy. And the last comment is: the United Nations is a circus. Would you like to respond? Or no comment?
Well, whether he believes, whether he believes the UN is a circus or not, it is surely partly a circus and partly a serious effort to contain international violence, and partly an effort to maintain a whole range of international cooperative activities. Most of the UN budget, after all, not the General Assembly's debate budget, but most of the budget goes to developmental activities, some portion of which I would note your correspondent continue to support Palestinian food programs, education programs, and so forth, in Gaza and parts of the West Bank.
However, Brooks, the Western countries as a whole are rather silent on the Israeli occupation of Palestine. I just think that they're not hard enough or firm enough as they have been with the Russian-Ukraine situation. And I
Well,
guess that does smack of double standards, does it not?
look, I listened to his comment, to your reading of his comments, and we've been talking about the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. I think any number of responses to Israeli-Palestinian conflict activities have come from Western nations. Whether you agree or disagree with the strength of them, that's someone else's business. But I think for the time being, I'm prepared to limit my discussion on Russia in Ukraine to Russia in Ukraine rather than try to deal with every aspect of all
Okay.
work.
Okay. Point taken, Brooks.
Sorry,
I do apologize. I do apologize. We've run out of time. Perhaps we can leave this interview for another time. I'd love to hear your views on it. So please, I hope you'll indulge us.
All right, you take care and give me a shout.
Certainly will do. Thank you indeed for your time. Go well. God bless.
You take care. Bye-bye.
8:47 exactly. Let's go for an overdue ad break, and then we'll be joined by Imran Mukaddam. He's a community activist and Eagle Eyes. Thank you indeed for your comments this morning. Maybe I can have a discussion in the future with Brooke Spector about the very issues you've raised this morning. Thank you indeed.